Good evening, Lake Orion. Welcome to History Now here on ONTV. I'm your host, Anthony Termina. This episode, I want to talk to you about the American-Cuban relations before the reign of Fidel Castro. Now, as you know, Fidel Castro took power in Cuba in 1959 following the Cuban Revolution, and that had a significant impact on Cuban-American relations. Now, but in this episode, I want to talk about the American-Cuban relation before the Cuban Revolution. Now, it's very important to understand that there is a lot of history between the United States and Cuba, and this even goes back to before the United States and Cuba were both countries. Back in the 1700s, the continental United States was controlled between Great Britain, France, Spain, and several Native American tribes, and Cuba at that time was occupied by Spain. So I want to mention briefly the history of Spanish Cuba. In the 1700s, as we made mention, Cuba was occupied by Spain. So in 1761, or 1760, be approximate, Spain participated in the 7 Years' War, which was a world war happening between Great Britain and France, and it included a theater in North America, better known as the French and Indian War. So Spain at first was neutral, but Spain decided to side with France and go against Great Britain. So as a result, the British ended up blockading Cuba and ended up occupying Havana in 1762. And as a result, Spain briefly lost Cuba until the Treaty of Paris in 1763, and Cuba was eventually returned to Spain. And Spain spent a lot of time trying to get back at Great Britain. So as a result, in the American Revolution, the Spanish ended up opening up trading ports to the colonists, to the colonials that were fighting against the British occupiers in 1776. Spain saw that as a way to get back at Great Britain, and during that time, it was Spain was successful in being able to get back at Great Britain by siding with the American colonists in the American Revolution. So they opened up trading ports in Cuba to the colonists, despite the massive British blockade over the continental United States. There was always thoughts, the U.S., back when it was developing into a country, the colonists now becoming the United States following 1783, when Britain finally accepted that, or let go of the continental United States. They accepted that the United States was their own country. But the U.S. always had thoughts of occupying Cuba. As I said, at this point, Cuba was already owned by Spain. There had always been thoughts about establishing trade. First priority was always about trade, and Cuba ended up being one of the major trading partners, which is only 90 miles from Key West, Florida. However, during the late 1800s, Florida was also part of Spain. So there was always thoughts from the newly formed American public of occupying Florida and then also occupying Cuba from Spain. And at that time, Spain was seen as primarily a weak power, that Spain was a European colonial power. There was, Britain had, for the most part, left continental North America. They still occupied some of Cuba. Spain had control of Louisiana at the time, which was that large, massive amount of land that was the west of the Mississippi, before France ended up taking it in 1803, briefly, which resulted in Thomas Jefferson buying all of Louisiana from the French in 1803. So that also became part of the United States. You still had the British and Canada, as we made mention. The French and the Spanish were controlling the Caribbean. The British were also there as well. So it resulted in that further strengthened American resolve of potentially occupying both Florida and Cuba. In 1818, there were opportunities to go get Cuba, or to go get Florida from Spain, so that resulted in the Adams-Ottness Treaty with Spain, and as a result, there was a brief war between the natives of Florida and the American Army, and then as a result, the Americans were able to get Florida from the Spanish, and but there were thoughts going into 1820, 1818, 1820. At this time, Thomas Jefferson's no longer president, but he had thoughts. He told then Secretary of State Calhoun, at the first possible chance, knowing full well that the Spanish were weak, that they could go in and occupy Cuba at the first possible opportunity. And there ended up being several attempts. You also cannot forget the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine proclaims that no European occupying power could come in and invade continental North America. Again, this followed the attempt by Spanish and the Portuguese to maintain their colonies in Central America and Southern and South America. And the Monroe Doctrine was a joint American-British stand against European colonialism in North America, particularly that by Spain, by Portugal, and also even by France. And that prevented the colonialization of the Americas following the wars in Central America and South America, directed mostly against Spain and Portugal. But Spain at that point still had Cuba. It still had several Caribbean islands, as did the Portuguese. It further illustrated the European perspective of, okay, you've got the British, the Austrians, the Russians, the Prussians were kind of the major powers in Europe, while the Spanish and Portuguese were seen as the weakest, were seen as declining powers in Europe. You also have to put the French kind of up there with the British, the Prussians, the Austrians, and the Russians as well. But Spain and Portugal were seen as trying to preserve their colonial empires. And one of those, especially in Spain's perspective, was Cuba. That the Americans always, as I made mention, had thoughts of wanting to occupy Cuba. There were several expeditions that were sent over towards Cuba with the intent of either buying Cuba or occupying Cuba. And there was one in the 1840s with led by Narciso Lopez. He had an expedition of over 40 Americans, and they were to go to Cuba with the intent of occupying Cuba. Spain found out. They had loyalist Cuban troops over there, loyalist Spanish troops who was in Cuba. They caught the expedition, and as a result, the expedition failed. And in 1851, 40 Americans, including Lopez, was executed by the Spanish in 1851. Spain was not happy. They sent a diplomatic protest to the United States, and they told the United States, do not occupy Cuba. Cuba is our land. You already got Florida. You do not go after Cuba. There were several other attempts as well. In 1854, there was the Ostend Manifesto, which was a private, secret proposal by U.S. diplomats, particularly those in the South, in attempting to make Cuba a slave state. Back then, there was competition between states over who was going to be a free state, who was going to be a slave state. Southern diplomats wanted Cuba to become a slave state. And this was originally supposed to be a private manifesto, but when it became public, it had resulted in a bad scandal where there was a lot of alienation. There was fear of alienating Spain again. And there was also, because at this point, Spain did not have slaves. They were not encouraging slavery at this point, and they did not want to get involved with slave trade again. So when this became public, when the northern states made this public, this eventually became a scandal, and as a result, it was rejected by the American public as a whole. So as a result, there was an attempt to make Cuba an American state, but at the end of the day, it was rejected, and Cuba was able to remain a country. However, it made Americans throughout the relationship between the United States and Cuba, Cubans wanted relations with them and the United States to be that of equal billing. However, the United States viewed Cuba as inferior, that they should be considered a state, that they shouldn't be their own country. So this caused a lot of resentment between Cubans and Americans. When we come back, we're going to discuss the Spanish-American War and its impacts it had on Cuba here on History Now, here on ONTV. Hello, Oakland County. This is Sammy Taramina talking OAA Now. In it, we'll talk various stories ranging from the state to Oakland County teams affecting the OAA. Catch us here on OAA Now. Welcome back to History Now here on ONTV. I'm your host, Anthony Taramina. Where we last left you, we were talking about, now we're in between 1878 at this point, the relationship between Cuba and the United States. There was starting to be some rebellion, especially from the northern areas in Cuba who favored relations with the United States, and was also wanting to seek independence from Spain and become their own countries. So for 10 years, there was a war that developed between Cuban rebels and the Spanish. And there was several attempts by the rebels to seek American support to help send troops into Cuba. But several American presidents, particularly William Taft, his regime, they rejected that support and said that this was a war that was going to be fought between the Cubans and the Spanish, and that the United States did not intervene in other countries' affairs at this point. There was continued attempts, however, to buy Cuba from American presidents. In 1897, President William McKinley offered to buy Cuba from the Spanish for $300 million. Spain, feeling that Cuba is a major source of wealth, particularly of tobacco and of cotton, and they rejected the offer. They rejected because saying that they have trade interests over in Cuba, and so as a result, there was continued hostilities between the United States and Spain. But at this time as well, the United States was also looking to expand its military power throughout the world. They were looking to show Britain and France and Germany at this time that, hey, the United States can be a military player as well. And they needed to make a statement. That statement actually came in Cuba, where there was an alleged incident that occurred in Havana Harbor, the sinking and the explosion of the USS Maine. There was several newspapers throughout both the United States and in Cuba saying that Spain was responsible for the sinking of the USS Maine, and the explosion and the sinking. And it caused war fever to go up into the United States, and as a result, the United States wanted a commission, and as a result, the United States and Spain went to war in 1898. The war lasted only 3 months. The United States gained tremendous success in Cuba. They gained success in the Philippines, and they also gained success in Puerto Rico. And as a result, the Treaty of Paris was, Spain sued for peace. The United States and Spain signed a peace treaty in Paris. It allowed the United States to have several Spanish colonial possessions. Spain finally gave up Cuba. They gave up Puerto Rico. They gave up the Philippines. And Cuba, for a time, was occupied by the United States until 1902, when the Americans actually gave the Cubans their independence under conditions of an amendment called the Platt Amendment, in which it stated that Cuba could never ever make a treaty with anyone threatening its independence without gaining permission from the United States to do business. It allowed the U.S. to militarily intervene in Cuba in case Cuban affairs were being threatened. There was also it allowed the Americans to have a naval base in Guantanamo Bay. Now, Guantanamo Bay, as we'll get to as we get into later, it remains a point of contention between the Americans and Cuban governments to this day. Guantanamo is in Cuba. However, the Americans do use it as a base, and it's still used as a base to this day to keep terrorists in prison committed for terroristic crimes against the United States. There was also, and Guantanamo was also used at that point as a naval base for the Navy, for the United States to do business in Guantanamo. So if basically there's a lease agreement, Cuba says they don't recognize it, that land belongs to Cuba. However, the United States says there's a lease out there that was agreed upon between the American and Cuban governments. And as a result, there remain several contentious disputes between the United States and Cuba governments to this day about the use and the base in Guantanamo. Now, 1902 would not be the last time the United States would occupy Cuba. In 1906, the U.S. would occupy Cuba. There was constant fears of election rigging in Cuba. The United States wanted Cuba to be a democracy. They wanted to maintain democratic, fair, free elections. There was fears that there was going to be political bad rigging. There was going to be so the United States occupied Cuba to make sure that the elections were free and fair, but they occupied Cuba for 3 years. So that allowed, but as I said too, these occupations would cause resentment between Cubans and how they felt about Americans and how Americans felt about Cubans being inferior. In 1912, there was a rebellion that took place. Cuba had an independent party that was of African American descent, and it was called the Negro Rebellion. If in Spanish, negro is black, so is the color black. So there was a rebellion. There was an independent party that wanted to be free of American influence, free of what is called the white oppressor rebellion, free of white oppressors. And as a result, there was also wanting to be free of the Cuban government. They wanted they wanted the Cuban government to be much more autonomous, much more focused on doing business with Latin America, Central America. And so the Cuban government called upon the American government for help, but also the Americans had their own interests in Cuba, business and trade interests, and they did not want to see that touched. So in 1912, the Americans came down, aided the Cuban government in suppressing the rebellion, and in 1912, briefly again occupied Cuba, but left after a few months later. And as a result, it forced upon, once again, another American intervention in Cuba. Now, the last time the Americans would intervene in Cuba, would occupy Cuba, would be from 1917 to 1922. There was fears in the United States that Germany, whom the United States was fighting with in World War I, would support Cuban opposition party groups, and that those groups would be sympathetic to Germany. So the United States, having just declared war on Germany, was sending troops into Europe. There was fears that Germany would try to encourage Cuban opposition party members to support Germany and to cause issues that with the Cuban government, with the United States as a whole. And so there was a lot of fear from the American side that Germany would encourage that type of resistance in Cuba. So once again, the United States went down, occupied Cuba again. So from 1917 to 1922, the United States occupied Cuba, and as a result, it further caused more tension between the Americans feeling that Cubans were inferior, and that the Cubans were resenting seen as American occupation. So there was also the good neighbor policy that the United States adopted towards Cuba in 1933 when Franklin D. Roosevelt came in. He wanted to have good relations with with the Latin American, Central American, Southern American partners down in the south of the United States, which included Cuba. Roosevelt ended up buying tanks towards Cuba, for Cuba. But at this time too, Cuba was going through a change as well, where had Ramon Garlu became president of Cuba, and he ended up ruling for 100 days. He ended up nullifying the Platt Amendment, which was the document between the United States and Cuba, and he ended up ruling for only 100 days. The American government would not recognize his government. It refused to do business. So as a result, it forced a new ruler to take place in Cuba, someone that was more friendlier to the United States. And then it would not be until 1940 when we return, I'm going to talk about the Batista regime and how that impacted American-Cuban relations here on History Now, here on ONTV.
We own a Habitat home.
I love working on my Habitat home.
Soy dueño de una casa de Habitat.
My neighbor is a Habitat homeowner.
Being a Habitat homeowner has changed our lives.
My mortgage payment for Habitat is less than what I paid for rent.
Habitat for Humanity of Oakland County currently has homes available with mortgage payments lower than most rent payments. If you or someone you know needs decent and affordable housing, call 248-338-1843 or visit our website at habitatoakland.org.
Welcome back to History Now here on ONTV. I'm your host, Anthony Taormina. I want to talk to you guys now about the regime of Fernando Batista, who ruled Cuba from 1940 to 1944 and would again take power in a coup from 1952 to 1959. At this point, relations between the United States and Cuba were somewhat tight. Cubans were pushing for more recognition of their country. They were pushing for more independence from the United States. Well, it would not happen under the Batista regime. At this point, when Batista took over, the American government immediately recognized his government. He also oppressed several Cubans, his Cuban opponents, often jailing Cuban opponents. He also allowed the United States to come in and dominate the Cuban economy. Corporations were coming into Havana. There was also the crime mobs. The American mafia were allowed to do business in Cuba. So you had a lot of illegal gambling. A lot of hotel businesses were in Cuba. There was a lot of corporations that took place in Cuba. And it felt like that Cuba was the Americans' closest friend at one point. It felt like that there was the Americans were dominating the Cuban economy. There was corporations, crime. This was probably the closest point the United States and Cuba got to before pre-revolution. When we talk about the next episode, we're going to talk about the Cuban Revolution and how the Batista government ended up alienating so many Cubans that it caused Cubans to rebel against the Batista regime, and also it caused the rise of one Fidel Castro. So this concludes the episode of the American-Cuban relations pre-Cuban Revolution. I encourage you guys to watch our second episode in the near future, which would focus on the American-Cuban relations post-Cuban Revolution, but also into the Cuban Revolution. And also we're going to talk about the Cold War and how it impacted Cuba. All right, have a great night, Lake Orion, and see you soon.